If we were to ask ourselves, how is it that exercise improves brain health and performance? Based on what you know now, you'd probably say, well, it increases arousal, the catecholamine, so dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine. It probably increases heart rate, so more blood pumping to the brain, and so on and so forth. And you would be correct about all of that. But let's just think a little bit more deeply about how exercise actually impacts the brain in the short and long term, and ask ourselves, what are the different physical pathways? What are the different chemical pathways by which the movement of our body changes the way that our brain works in the short and long term? So if we were to draw a stick figure of a human and sort of orient ourselves to the different locations or organs in the body that contain potential sources of information for the brain, one place that we could start would be, of course, the heart. When you do cardiovascular exercise of any kind, intense or not so intense, short or long, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases. Likewise, if you do resistance training, there will be heart rate increases. Those heart rate increases will come down between sets, but your heart rate tends to increase when you exercise. That's sort of a duh. Well, when your heart rate increases, there's actually both increased blood flow to the brain and the delivery of all the things that that blood carries. But there are also neural pathways that carry signals about that heart rate, about those blood pressure changes to the brain in order to increase our levels of alertness and focus that we can leverage toward learning. So the first location in the body that we know can communicate with the brain is the heart. When our heart beats faster, that's communicated to our autonomic nervous system, which resides in a number of different brain areas. In fact, it's a network of brain areas that act in concert to create what we call autonomic arousal. We also have another pathway that goes back from the brain to the heart and other organs that we call the vagus nerve, which is a two-directional pathway, up from the body to the brain and from the brain back to the body. We're going to talk a lot about the vagus. In fact, let's talk about the vagus now. When we exercise, we release adrenaline, which is also called epinephrine, from our adrenal glands, which are small glands that reside atop both of our kidneys. That adrenaline, or epinephrine, as it's also called, does many things in our body. It's responsible for increasing our heart rate further. It's responsible for a number of effects on the so-called endothelial cells that make up the vessels and capillaries. And it has impacts on the neurons in our body that create all sorts of changes in the way that blood flows, how fast it flows, and so on and so forth. Now, here's a key thing to understand. Adrenaline, epinephrine, does not cross the blood-brain barrier. So the adrenaline from our adrenals doesn't actually get into the brain to stimulate elevated levels of alertness. Rather, it acts on receptors on the vagus nerve. Again, the vagus nerve communicates with the brain, and also in the vagus nerve, certain brain areas communicate with the body. So adrenaline has a lot of effects within the body, but when it's released, it also acts on so-called adrenergic receptors on the vagus nerve. Then the vagus nerve is activated in a way that stimulates the activity of a brain area, because remember, the vagus goes from the body into the brain, stimulates the so-called NST, and because neuroanatomists like to argue about naming, sometimes it'll also be called the NTS, the nucleus of the solitary tract, or the nucleus tractus solitarius. Super annoying, I know. Forget the acronym unless you want to know that it's sometimes NST and sometimes it's NTS. Don't ask me why neuroanatomists do this. In any case, the NST can then communicate with a really important brain area whose name you should remember, which is the locus ceruleus. The locus ceruleus contains neurons that release, among other things, norepinephrine, which is similar in action to epinephrine, but different. Neurons in the locus ceruleus send those little wires that we call axons into the brain in a very widespread manner. It's almost as if they're positioned to sprinkler the brain with a neurochemical, and that neurochemical is norepinephrine. They also have the capacity to release other neurochemicals, but right now we're concentrating on norepinephrine. When norepinephrine is released from the locus ceruleus, it has this tendency to elevate the levels of activity in other brain areas through this sort of sprinklering-like mechanism. What that means is that other areas of the brain, such as your prefrontal cortex, such as your hippocampus, such as different areas of the hypothalamus, and indeed lots of brain circuits, all have a greater capacity to be engaged. This is what we're talking about when we talk about autonomic arousal. Release of adrenaline from the adrenals that has action within the body, elevated heart rate, blood pressure, etc. And then adrenaline also from the adrenals to the vagus, from the vagus to the NST, NST to locus coeruleus, and then locus coeruleus sprinklers the brain with this norepinephrine, raising the levels of baseline activity in all those brain areas and making them more likely to be engaged by things that we're trying to attend to, more likely to engage, say, the neurons of the prefrontal cortex that can learn context-dependent strategy switching, such as in a Stroop task, or when we're trying to attend to information and we go, okay, here's something important. I need to pay attention to this. We're able to do that because of that elevated level of norepinephrine. It facilitates, it's permissive for elevating our levels of attention and focus. It's also permissive for our hippocampus to encode new memories and for a bunch of other brain areas to do their thing, so to speak. So knowing these mechanisms is actually worthwhile. If you've ever heard that exercise can give you energy, this is the basis of that statement. Right? Many people, in fact, myself for many years thought, okay, I definitely have to sleep well in order to have energy and focus. That's absolutely true. Still true, will always be true. I should maybe have some caffeine, be hydrated, well nourished, all this stuff in order to have the energy to exercise. But it's also true that exercise gives us energy. And this is how it gives us energy. When we move our body, the adrenals release adrenaline, and the adrenaline acts through two different so-called parallel pathways within the body. But again, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So then there's a series of what we call signaling relays or circuit relays up to the locus coeruleus, and then a sort of analog. It's different, but an analog to epinephrine, norepinephrine, is released within the brain. And lo and behold, we have elevated levels of both bodily energy and brain energy and focus that we can devote to that exercise, but also to the learning that comes after that exercise, which explains pretty much everything that we've talked about up until now during the course of this podcast. So the next time you're feeling a little tired and you don't want to work out, remember, exercise gives you energy through the pathways that I just described. Now, anytime I talk about the adrenals, people start talking about adrenal burnout. They say, oh, you burn out your adrenals. There are these crazy theories that you'll hear out there. Coffee burns out your adrenals. Not true. You'll hear that if you exercise too much, it might burn out your energy or your adrenals. Look, you have enough capacity within your adrenals to survive relatively long famines, to survive long bouts of challenge, stress of many, many different kinds, short challenges, and so on. You're not going to burn out your adrenals. There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real syndrome. There are diseases of the adrenals, but that's not what we're referring to here. You have plenty of adrenaline in your adrenals that you can deploy through movement, through exercise, to get the elevation in arousal, attention, and so forth that we've been talking about. In fact, there's a set of biological pathways that were just recently discovered that will allow you to understand how to use movement in order to engage your adrenals so that then those adrenals can release adrenaline, impact your vagus, impact the organs of your body, the locus coeruleus, and elevate your levels of attention and focus. And a lot of the core components of these pathways are highlighted in a paper that I absolutely love, another paper I absolutely love. This is from Peter Strick's laboratory at University of Pittsburgh, which is entitled The Mind-Body Problem, Circuits that Link the Cerebral Cortex to the Adrenal Medulla. The adrenal medulla are those adrenals that I've been referring to in the body. And the question that Peter Strick and colleagues asked was, how is it that movement actually gets the adrenals to release adrenaline? Like, what's the signal? Does it come from the muscles? Does it come from, the skeleton? It's perfectly reasonable to assume that there are signals that come from the muscles and from the skeleton that cause the adrenals to release adrenaline when we exercise. But what Strick and colleagues did was actually super clever. They took some new tools that had just become available. These are tools that allow the tracing of neural circuits from organs in the body all the way back up to the brain, or from one brain structure to another brain structure, and then to yet another brain structure. We don't have time to go into all the technical details, but this is a technique that perhaps I'll talk about on a future podcast. It's one that my laboratory used for a number of years to trace other neural pathways. What they discovered is that there are essentially three categories of brain areas, all of which communicate with the adrenals and can cause them to release adrenaline to create this elevation in arousal and attention. Those three brain areas include areas of the brain that are involved in thinking, what we call cognition, areas of the brain that are related to what are called affective states, which is just kind of a more general category that includes emotions. And then there's a third category of brain areas that most robustly communicates with the adrenals. And these are a collection of brain areas that are all involved with movement of particular areas of our body. These areas are broadly referred to as the motor network. So these are areas of the so-called cerebral cortex, which are in the outer portion of the brain. And they send these wires down the spinal cord. There's a little relay in the spinal cord called the IML. In any case, these brain areas that are involved in motor movement send axons, those wires, down to the spinal cord. Then from the spinal cord, they send a relay out via what's called the cholinergic preganglionic neurons. Basically, what ends up happening is that acetylcholine, which is a neuromodulator, is released from these neurons that originate in the spinal cord onto the adrenal medulla. And then the adrenal medulla, the so-called adrenals, same thing, adrenal medulla, adrenals, releases adrenaline. That creates these effects in the body on the heart, the muscles, and other tissues. And then, as described before, that adrenaline also acts on the vagus up to the NST, the locus ceruleus, and we have this elevation in alertness. So this paper and papers that came subsequent to it really explain how it is that the movement of our body, aka exercise, allows us to have this elevation in arousal and alertness. It's a loop, okay? The adrenals release adrenaline. They do these things by these two parallel pathways I've been talking about. But your decision to engage these motor areas, to move particular areas of your body, is what deploys that adrenaline. Now, you might be thinking, well, duh, okay? When I exercise, there's adrenaline release. In order to exercise, I need to move my body, and these brain areas control the movement of my body. But it's not a duh. It's actually very profound, because it turns out that the specific brain areas that best activate the adrenals are the brain areas that control the muscles closest to the midline, the core musculature, and the brain areas that are involved in generating the sorts of movements that we would call compound movements, at least in the context of resistance training, or that are responsible for moving multiple joints at the same time. So what this means in the practical sense is, if you are feeling sluggish, you want energy, or you're simply exercising both for bodily effects and for brain effects, you need the deployment of adrenaline, of epinephrine. You need the deployment of norepinephrine in the brain. And by the way, anytime you have a deployment of norepinephrine in the brain, almost always there's a coordinated action of release of dopamine, which most people have heard of by now. Dopamine is involved in motivation as well as movement, etc. So the simple takeaway here is, if you want to get the arousal that comes from exercise, in order to use that arousal, to leverage it towards better cognition, brain health, etc., the key thing is to make sure that you're doing exercises that are compound exercises. So that these would be the movements. You can look these up, just say compound exercises. You can put that anywhere, and you'll see that that includes things like squats, deadlifts, bench presses, dips, pull-ups, rows. And yes, of course, you want to train your whole body so that you have, symmetry of function, of strength, and you want to offset any injuries and things of that sort, or aesthetic reasons, perhaps. But the idea here is, if you want energy from exercise, you want focus, you need the deployment of the neurochemicals that we've been discussing, most notably epinephrine and norepinephrine. And through the identification of this motor network, as well as the affective and cognitive networks that converge on this area of the spinal cord and then send communication to the adrenal medulla, you can essentially control the levels of arousal that your body and brain produces. So in describing this, my hope is that you'll no longer think about exercise as just elevating your heart rate, or you no longer think about exercise just as moving your body, but rather that the movement of your body is creating specific neurochemical outcomes, both in the body and the brain, that create the arousal that initiates the improvements in focus and attention that allow you to learn better and that contribute generally to brain health and longevity. And of course, you aficionados out there will remind me, I'm sure, but I'm going to beat you to the punch here. Yes, your hypothalamus is also talking to your pituitary, which releases certain chemicals into your bloodstream, which also go to your adrenals to cause your adrenals to deploy both adrenaline, epinephrine, as well as cortisol. That pathway is still intact, okay? But that's a slightly slower pathway. Here I'm focusing on the neural pathways, some of which have only recently been discovered in the last 5 or 10 years, that work very, very fast to generate the sorts of arousal that are relevant to brain function and brain longevity, okay? Nothing has changed in terms of the old story about how the brain impacts the adrenals. That's all still there, but here we're into the modern stuff. So this idea that we can actually control our body with our mind, and to some extent, our mind with our body, that's absolutely true. And this is one of the tools that I find particularly useful anytime I want to overcome that wall of kind of resistance to not doing the physical exercise that I know I and basically all of us should be doing. Okay, so let's think just a little bit more about how the body communicates with the brain during exercise, both in order to understand the mechanisms by which exercise improves brain health and function, but also ways that we can leverage that to improve brain health and function by using exercise. One of the more interesting and powerful and indeed surprising ways that the body communicates with the brain during exercise to improve brain health, and indeed our ability to remember things and to learn, is the way that our bones, our skeleton, when they're under loads, okay, when they experience mechanical stress, not severe mechanical stress that would break them, but mechanical stress, they release hormones, in particular, something called osteocalcin. Now, you might be thinking, wait, the bones release hormones? Yes, your bones release hormones, one of which is called osteocalcin. Osteocalcin is an incredible molecule. Animal studies that were done mainly at Columbia School of Medicine, but later also at Columbia and elsewhere in humans have shown that osteocalcin is released from the bones during exercise, both in mice and in humans, travels to the brain so it can cross the blood-brain barrier. And there it can encourage the growth of neurons and their connections within the hippocampus, an area of the brain that's vitally important for the encoding of new memories. And there are some data, not a ton, but there's some data which suggests that perhaps, I want to highlight, underscore, and boldface, perhaps, can increase the number of neurons in the so-called dentate gyrus of the hippocampus to allow even better capacity for memory. Now, osteocalcin is therefore a really interesting molecule, right? Comes from bones, travels to the brain, improves functioning of the hippocampus, which is important for learning and memory. That's amazing. And it does so in part through the actions of something that most of you perhaps have heard of, which is called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now, it's very important for us to understand that anytime we hear about exercise increases a growth factor, and by the way, exercise increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor, it increases growth factors that cause the growth of endothelial cells, so blood vessels, we'll talk more about that in a moment, and it increases nerve growth factor. It's not just BDNF. There are lots of different growth factors, a few of which, NGF and BDNF, act on neurons, and other growth factors that act on endothelial cells, vasculature. It seems that a lot of the effects of BDNF on the brain that are caused by doing exercise and that benefit us in terms of short and long-term memory, our ability to encode new things and remember them for long periods of time, to resist age-related degeneration, because that's the case indeed, that our hippocampus decreases in volume over time as we age, just naturally, even in somebody that doesn't have Alzheimer's dementia. And exercise can adjust the slope of that decline significantly, provided there's enough exercise and the appropriate exercise. I don't think all, but many of the effects of BDNF appear to be mediated by osteocalcin. What this means is that any exercise program that's designed not just to benefit our body, but also our brain health and performance should do something to load the skeleton in some sort of impactful way that causes the release of osteocalcin. Now, unfortunately, there has not been a systematic exploration of the specific types of exercise that best cause the release of osteocalcin in humans. But based on what we understand about how osteocalcin is made and released, it seems reasonable to assume and reasonable to employ some exercise within your weekly exercise that involves jumping of some sort. In particular, jumping where you have to control the eccentric or landing portion of that jump. Now, I'm certainly not the first to talk about this. It's been discussed in a different context. That is, jumping and landing has been discussed in a different context, namely by Peter Attia and others who have talked about the fact that as people age, one of the primary causes of mortality are the infections and the lack of mobility caused by falls that people generally have when they're going downstairs or down things. Stepping down is a common source of falls. Falls are a common source of breaking things. Breaking things is a common source of inactivity, and inactivity is a common source of infections and other things that lead to earlier mortality. What this means for all of us, young, middle-aged, and old, is that we should include some form of jumping in our weekly exercise. Now, you could imagine doing that within your high-intensity interval training, provided you can do it safely and not get injured. But this is also a call for all of us to think about including, say, some jumping rope. And if you're going to jump rope, maybe not just jumping, a centimeter off the ground to be able to just consistently skip along, but maybe doing some high knees, maybe doing some double unders if you can do those. Perhaps doing some box jumps. So jumping off boxes at different heights, again, what you can do safely without getting injured, no doubt is going to provide load to the skeleton. I guess unless you're doing it underwater in outer space, it's hard to imagine how it wouldn't. And that seems to me like the most direct way to employ this osteocalcin pathway. This pathway from the bones to the brain and neurogenesis in the hippocampus, I do believe, is likely to underlie a lot of the enhancement of learning and memory that's seen in terms of the chronic effects of exercise on brain health and brain function over time. That is, not just the things that exercise does via arousal in the minutes and hours after exercise, but the way that exercise can improve literally the size and structure of one of the most critical structures in our brain that's responsible for learning and memory, the hippocampus. And of course, there are a lot of other ways that the body communicates with the brain. We definitely don't have time to go through all of them, but it's worth thinking about a few of them logically, just in terms of listing them off and thinking about how they might communicate with the brain to improve brain health and longevity. When you exercise, you utilize fuel differently, depending on whether or not you're relying on glycogen or fatty acids. And of course, it's going to depend on how long you've been exercising and the type of exercise and what you're using for fuel, literally the foods you eat, etc. We don't have time to go into all of that, but get this. Turns out that there are liver to brain neural pathways. So your liver can communicate with neurons and other cells in your brain, including the glial cells, the cells that are important for regulating energy metabolism and a bunch of other things too. Your liver can communicate to your brain both through neural pathways and by releasing things into your bloodstream that then communicate to your brain, oh, the body is using a different source of fuel. It's been using different sources or combinations of fuels for the last 20 minutes. Maybe you should adjust your brain state in order to be able to cope with that or in response to that. And of course, there are other organs in the body that are communicating with the brain also. Your diaphragm, for instance, is communicating with your brain through indirect pathways about how you're breathing during exercise. And of course, your brain is controlling your diaphragm too via a number of stations, including the pathway that includes the phrenic nerve, which controls the diaphragm. The point here is that once you start exercising, of course, it has an impact on the organs in your body. They change the way that they're functioning. Your heart, your liver, your adrenals, your skeleton, literally your bones, and of course your muscles. And they are releasing things that impact brain function either directly or indirectly. Once you start thinking about exercise in that context, even if we don't parse each and every one of those pathways individually, you can start thinking about exercise as a multifactorial way of enhancing and changing brain activity so that it positions it to learn better in the subsequent hours and days, as well as modifying areas of the brain like the hippocampus by making certain brain areas literally bigger, more powerful at engaging the sorts of things that they do. In the case of the hippocampus, learning. In the case of the prefrontal cortex, context-dependent decision-making, updating strategies, these sorts of things. And generally speaking, exercise causes the release of things like BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and nerve growth factor that enhance the health and stability of existing neuron connections. And something that is very rarely, if ever, discussed publicly, not because it's some sort of secret that people want to keep, but I just don't hear it discussed, is that BDNF is an activity-dependent molecule. It's a molecule that can serve to stabilize and enhance the growth of neurons, keep their connections in place, grow new connections, and it does so when neurons are active. So the point is that BDNF has to be released in order for that to happen, but the release of BDNF itself is activity-dependent, and it acts best on neurons that are already active. So if ever there was a mechanism that could explain why it is that people that exercise regularly seem to maintain healthier brains into later life, it's that one. It's that BDNF is activity dependent. And when I say activity dependent, I mean the electrical activity of neurons is what causes the release of BDNF. And then once BDNF is released, it has the best opportunity to stabilize and enhance the growth of existing neurons if those other neurons are already active. Now, if we were to list off all the different pathways and mechanisms by which exercise improves brain health and performance, it would be a list of probably, somewhere between 40 and 100 different molecular pathways, and probably, some somewhere between 12 and 20 different anatomical pathways. And we certainly don't have time for all that. I don't think that's what you're interested in. I've tried to just highlight some of the key ones today. One additional one that I'd like to highlight is the lactate pathway, or the impact of lactate when we exercise. This is getting discussed more and more these days on podcasts and elsewhere. One interesting finding, for instance, is that lactate is what's produced when we exercise intensely. Our muscles produce lactate, and lactate is a very powerful appetite suppressant. Now, some of you may be saying, when I exercise hard, I get really, really hungry. Well, that may be true, but it's also true that if you exercise really, really hard, and then you hydrate well, and you wait a little while, oftentimes that hunger will subside. I'm not saying that you should starve yourself after exercise. Fuel as needed for you. If you're an intermittent faster, do that thing. If you like to eat right after you exercise, do that. Do what's best for you. But understand that lactate has powerful effects on our appetite. Because why? Because lactate has powerful effects not just on our body, but on our brain. And it is able to impact the activity of neurons in our so-called hypothalamus, a little marble-sized region above the roof of our mouth, that contains some of the neurons that control our appetite and our degree of satiety. So the point here is that lactate is a molecule produced in the body that can actually signal to the brain. Most of you perhaps have heard that lactate can be used as a fuel for neurons. During exercise, lactate is the preferred fuel for neurons under most circumstances, especially under circumstances of intense exercise. That spares glucose for other things, including for cognitive work later on. This is perhaps one of the reasons why when people do intense exercise, provided it's not too long and too intense, and then you go to learn something, you have enhanced focus. It's because of the arousal we've been talking about all along today, but it's also because we believe that there's glucose, there's fuel that's been spared that then can be used by the neurons because during the exercise, you weren't using quite as much glucose, you were using lactate. Now, lactate is also a stimulus for something called the blood-brain barrier, which is made up of endothelial cells, specialized endothelial cells that act as a barrier so that certain things, in particular large molecules, can't cross from the body into the brain. Lactate stimulates the release of something called VEGF, VGEF, which is basically an endothelial growth factor that promotes the stability and growth of the blood-brain barrier. This is very important in the context of brain health and longevity in particular, because one of the major features of age-related cognitive decline, and one that's greatly exacerbated in Alzheimer's, is a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So the integrity, the structure and function of the blood-brain barrier is something that's very important and related to brain health. And exercise that's intense enough to produce lactate causes the increase in VEGF that acts on and within the endothelial cells to improve the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. And because I mentioned the astrocytes earlier, and because I did my postdoc with somebody that was sort of famous for popularizing the study of astrocytes when no one else wanted to study the astrocytes, now everybody studies the astrocytes. But I have to mention something about astrocytes, which, no, they're not just a support cell. Certain types of cells in the brain are called glia. The glia come in multiple forms, oligodendrocytes. In the periphery, they're called Schwann cells. But then you also have astrocytes, and astrocytes sit around the synapse. They ensheathe synapses. Remember, synapses are the communication points between neurons. And the astrocytes are beautifully positioned to read out the amount of activity that's occurring between neurons and produce fuel for those neurons. So the astrocytes mainly use glucose for fuel, but they can produce lactate. So again, we have this activity-dependent phenomenon. That is, when certain neurons are very, very active, the astrocytes are able to produce more lactate. The neurons can use lactate, spares glucose, and a bunch of great things happen. When I say great things happen, I mean in the context of the ways that exercise can improve brain function, because those elevated levels of lactate in turn also increase BDNF. Basically, the muscles producing lactate is terrific, but the astrocytes producing lactate for the neurons to feed on is also terrific because lactate can be used as a fuel and it triggers all these downstream or subsequent mechanisms, including BDNF. So basically what we're talking about is the lots and lots of ways that exercise improves brain health in the long term, BDNF, brain plasticity, stability of synapses, and so forth. Maybe even new neurons, maybe. Not a lot of evidence for that in humans yet, frankly, but maybe. And exercise can improve brain function in the short term through mechanisms of arousal, but also through alternate fuel usage, such as lactate from the body and from cells within the brain that we call the astrocytes, and the release of all sorts of other things, IGF-1 to promote more vasculature, and on and on and on. It's really quite beautiful. The